Further ado, I am proud to introduce our speaker, Dr. Fred Kwong. Dr. Fred Kwong is currently the CISO and AVP Security, Identity, and Operations for Delta Dental Plans Association. He's a highly recognized thought leader in security and is often asked to speak and chair at national and international security conferences. Dr. Kwong serves on several advisory boards and is often asked to consult on matters of security and leadership. He currently holds the CISP, CISA, CISM, PMP, and CDPSE certifications. Earned his bachelor's in psychology and professional communications, master's of business administration management information systems from Roosevelt University, and holds his doctorate in organizational development from Benedictine University. Well, please help me welcome Dr. Fred Kwong.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate the warm introduction. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this session. If you're looking for something as great as our keynote from Scott, you're going to be highly disappointed. But nevertheless, thank you for joining our session here. And, we're going to talk a little bit about cloud security today. But I really wanted to focus our session today in talking about, as a project manager, what is it that you really need to know about cloud security, and how can I enable my business or my company to do better in these areas while still affording the luxury of being a good PM, right? And so I hope your takeaways for this session are really going to be helping you understand some of the things that I think about when it comes to security, how that can translate in the project management world, and things that you can take back directly on your next project when you're thinking about cloud-based security. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my slides, and we'll get going. Okay, so quick disclaimer from my side. Normally I like to put these disclaimers out just because I want to be able to protect my own organization in case you hear something that you feel is not specifically kosher. And these days you all have to be careful. So, hey, what I say here is just about me and, my thoughts on cloud security, and don't constitute my organization. Uh, I always like to start with a little bit of humor, and for those that have been around as long as I have, Dilbert is the fundamental of security humor these days. Um, so a little brief there. Okay, quickly moving forward, I want to talk about our agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's the difference between cloud versus traditional security. I'll talk about cloud security as a whole, kind of what's trending in there, and then looking at uh, how do we PM these cloud-based projects and what do we need to do associated with them. A lot of this stuff I'm going to skip over fairly quickly. I'm not going to, dive into it really deep because, I'm assuming that everyone has some level of fundamentals here. But I do want to touch on it in case there are folks that are kind of new to this industry, right? And new to uh, working within IT and project management. So, in non-cloud environments, the one thing that we really have to concern ourselves is, we have servers, we have infrastructure, we have our desktops and laptops that we have to deal with, and a lot of our applications, they're developed in house and maintained in house, right? That's kind of the traditional uh, non-cloud environment, right? We have our own data centers, or we lease a data center that we own and manage at the end of the day. And most of our staff is full-time consultants or consultants that work specifically for our organization. So this is something that's been tried and true for quite a long time. So nothing too special from that perspective. I want to talk a little bit about the cloud. And the cloud, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so with that, I just wanted to get through a little bit of the alphabet soup portion of this. And when you think about the cloud, there's a lot of different services associated with it. You have software as a service, data, platform, infrastructure, and network, right? All of this is really considered part of the cloud. And when I think about, this alphabet soup that we live in, it can get confusing. Um, but I just wanted to provide a couple different examples of each one of these. So when you're thinking about infrastructure as a service, think about Google or an AWS or an Azure, where they're providing you basically uh, the server infrastructure required to run your applications, um, needed to then put those out in a data center that is not yours, right? A virtual data center that is owned by one of those providers. You have things like data as a service, things like Snowflake, where you have databases and Tableau and Power BI, and all that's actually housed in the cloud, right? Associated very closely with software as a service. Think about things like Office 365, right? And then finally, things like network as a service. You have things like Akamai. Also on the platform side, they do a bit of that as well, along with some of these other providers. And a lot of these guys are obviously mixing it all up, right? At this point, they're doing a little bit of everything. So, um, if you're interested in kind of learning more about those, I would just take some time and kind of Google the acronyms, right? And you'll get a whole bunch of different data points associated with it. We also have this concept of a private versus public cloud. And the concept there really is on a private cloud, it is a dedicated environment that you have that's not necessarily owned. So think back to your rack spaces of the world and those types of organizations which provide you cloud services that are dedicated for your organization. The public cloud is the ones that are like your AWSs, your GCPs, and Azure. And right now, we're seeing a lot more public cloud instances being used. Now, that's not to say that anybody and everybody can get into your cloud instance, right? That's not necessarily how it works, but that's just kind of how it's known as the differences between public and private cloud. So inside the cloud environment, it's there's some opposites to the non-prod environment or non-cloud environment that I had mentioned, right? So you have things where servers are hosted within the vendor data center, right? You have IT focuses on integrations and configuration. So no longer do you really have to worry about, well, what do I have to do to monitor and maintain the server infrastructure itself? Think about the hardware there, right? A lot of it's more about, well, I just need to configure this system. I have to pick things like proc, memory, CPU, amount of storage, and then I can spin up servers, right? Just from those few data points. In cloud environments, desktops and laptops can be virtualized. There's things you can have a virtual cloud instances of your desktops that you work in. A lot of the development is then enhanced in-house still, but maintenance is shared, right? So there's really more of a focus on the applications and application lifecycle at that point. And then there's a concept around the shared responsibility model, and this is an important one that I want to dive a little bit more deeper into. And when we think about the shared responsibility model, it really speaks to not only what do you have to do as an organization and IT, very specifically, what do they own versus what does the cloud provider own or do for you. So I'm going to use the AWS responsibility model as an example. And this is true for most cloud providers. So don't take this as an AWS only piece. But most cloud providers will tell you that they have a shared responsibility model. And if you think about this at a high level, it makes a lot of sense, right? There are things that you do, and then there's things that the cloud provider does for you. And both of these things really have to come together and enable security, right? And enable good operations inside of the cloud platform. So inside of AWS, you have things like the database, the networking, all those things, compute and storage. Again, more on the infrastructure side, where AWS has the responsibility for the security of that. A good example of this would be if you think about the physical security of that data center. Well, obviously, you're not responsible, or your organization's not going to be responsible for that, right? AWS's job is to make sure that their data center is secure. and not anybody can just walk into one of those data centers, right? Including other people that, quote unquote, purchase into the services. So AWS is very, good at keeping people away from the data centers. They have things like actually called black sites where, people don't necessarily go into those data centers at any given time. And so with that, we need to make sure that we understand the responsibilities there. Now, on the customer side, we have the applications, the things that we install into that data center or that cloud platform, right? And the use of the configurations there, right? So if you think about from a configuration perspective, you gotta think, well, hey, I can open up a firewall, and a firewall, for those that aren't familiar, is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a barrier between the internet and that cloud service. And you can open it up to anybody, or you can leave it closed to everybody, right? You control that front door at the end of the day. And so that's where that configuration piece comes in. AWS is going to be like, hey, and the other cloud providers are going to be like, hey, you can do whatever you want here, but keep in mind, it's your data and your job to protect it, right? We don't know, and we're not going to look into what's on your services and what you need to do to protect it, right? They don't have the crystal ball, as it were, to say, hey, this is who should have access to these things and who shouldn't, right? That's your determination, your organization's job to understand that. So things like the identity, access control, the data itself, right? It's your job to provide security inside of that cloud when you think about the shared responsibility model here. Okay.
Dr. Kwong,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but we do have a request. Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh,
Some people are saying they can't hear you really well.
okay. Let me just make sure that I have everything set correctly on my side, and I will turn this up a little bit. Does that sound okay? Is that better for everybody? Everyone hear me okay?
Thank you.
All right. Yep. Feel free to just mention something else if you're having problems hearing me. So thanks for that. Okay. I will continue to move on to non-cloud based project management and talking a little bit about, again, high level. These are things that you're traditionally going to do from a project management perspective when you're talking about a uh, non-cloud based project, right? So you're going to have your architecture team that's going to help design and engineer what needs to go in the infrastructure. You're going to have to do planning and tracking and analysis, all the things that, again, traditional PM that you're going to be doing. Things like UAT testing, ultimate responsibility for delivery, interaction, coding, and coordinating with the internal teams to make sure that everybody understands what they need to do. And of course, the traditional timeframes and allotments of the project, right? So, again, nothing new for you guys, but I just want to use this slide as the contrast to cloud services. And the reason I bring it up is there's some nuances when you think about the project management with cloud services. For one, there's less time dealing with design and architecture. And the reason why that's the case is if you think about it, your decisions are done much quicker inside of the cloud. And this is one of the benefits of the cloud. You can easily spin up and spin down services from the cloud without a lot of need to go into architectural detail. So the design becomes very quickly once you understand the fundamentals of how the cloud and that cloud environment is set up. And when I say that fundamental, I'm talking about how does AWS set up things like routing and switching and infrastructure and spinning those things up. A lot of that becomes very easy. A lot of it becomes templatized as you build more into the cloud, and it becomes very quickly. So the advantage of the cloud from that perspective is instead of taking days to spin up servers, you can take minutes to spin up servers and systems that you need, including security posture. So that's another important piece. Another piece that's kind of different is that you're probably going to need less staffing of sorts. If you think about it, and this makes sense, right? Today, in a traditional non cloud environment, your operations team deals with the infrastructure and they deal with upgrades and they deal with hard drive failures and memory failures and those types of things. Well, that goes away in the cloud environment, so you don't have to worry about that from a operations keep the lights on perspective as much. So from a project perspective, when you think about things that you need to do, or time that the engineer or operator needs or administrator needs, it's going to be a little bit less in those types of scenarios. Debugging gets a little bit simplified because it happens at the remote site. You don't have to worry about operational nuances to how it's going to affect your other applications because you're building it inside a cloud specific environment. But one thing that you do have to worry about is the cost modeling. It's much more complicated now from a cloud perspective. Most cloud providers do a per use charge. Um, if you think about, taxi fare, right, type of scenario, once you start that system, it's the clock keeps clicking on it, right? And so, in order to understand or estimate the cost associated with your project, it's a lot different, and you have to understand the cost model that these cloud providers use. And they charge you for everything, right? So, if you need monitoring, that's a charge. If you need, proc CPU memory, it's going to depend on the sizing associated with those things. And that's where you talk about things when you think about the cloud. You want to right size things. You want to be able to flex up as needed and flex down because it's going to affect how much money your overall project is going to cost. And so with that, you want to make sure that you really understand the cost modeling and the billing cycles associated with the cloud. And there's ways to make that cost less as well overall. So there's a per charge model, but there's also a known entity model that they use, right? So for example, if you need a system up 8 by 5 uh, every day, well, you can pay that in advance or lock that in and you get a discounted rate associated with that. And all those things kind of factor in. So when you're thinking about your development environments that you're going to need from a project perspective, obviously those are things that you're going to want to spin up and spin down. But then from a production and operations moving forward, you may want to look into locking in some of those pricing. So it becomes really important when you're going through staging and QA and testing that you get a good baseline of what you think the model is going to look like, and that will help you lock in costs later on. Vendor management is a very important piece, and I'll talk about this also from a security perspective. Things like um, data and how it resides in the cloud provider is becomes very important when you think about the contracts and how we need to protect it from a contractual perspective. So if you know that you're dealing with sensitive type of information, whether it's business confidential, PII, uh, PCI data, right? All those things that you're going to have to worry about from a confidential business data perspective, you're going to want to work very closely with your contracts team and your legal team to make sure that the language is there to protect the data. Because you're going to have folks from the cloud provider that potentially have access to that data, or if they don't have access directly to the data, they have access to where the data is stored, right? And so, from a PM perspective, you want to get ahead of that ahead of time because number one, it means more contract time. And if anybody has ever worked in any organization, I'm sure you understand that contracting is not necessarily the fastest process in the world, especially when you're dealing with a lot of legalese and when you're dealing with a third party provider where you might have to build in a business associate agreement or some sort of contractual language in terms of data protection and indemnification. Those things are going to take a little bit more time, right? So kind of keep that in mind when you think about your project planning. And you want to keep track of where that's kind of going. I know from prior experience, you want to necessarily get not only yourself involved in that contracting process, but making sure that your security teams are working with the legal team, because the legal team may not necessarily understand all the nuances when it comes to the data and the data protection side. And so you want to make sure that you're taking some time to have those teams connect, make sure that they understand what are the ramifications around data and data privacy, but then also think about your architecture teams and making sure that what they're planning to build out can be successfully secured inside of that cloud environment, and that the cloud provider is willing to do their nuances associated with that. Not a lot of the cloud providers are going to wipe their hands associated with the customer side of that. Remember the shared responsibility model, but you need to make sure you're holding them accountable for the other components of that. All right, so I'm going to spend the rest of my time really kind of focusing on the cloud security and cloud security concepts here. And a lot of my slideware here is based off of the cloud security report from 2020 from Cybersecurity Insiders, and I have a link to that later on in my slides for those that are interested in looking at the report. It's a comprehensive survey of about 650 cyber professionals, and it really kind of spoke to what were their thoughts in terms of cloud security and our ability to protect in the cloud. Uh, it was brought on by a lot of IT executives and security practitioners. So across a various amount of different businesses. So just give you kind of some ideas as to where these data points are coming from. Um, but to answer the question, should you be concerned about cloud security? I think the answer is an overwhelming yes. As more and more organizations move into the cloud and we're trying to leverage the cloud for all the benefits that we have there is a big concern in terms of how we need to handle security inside of the cloud and what does that look like. So when we think about what are the concerns in the cloud, the biggest ones obviously are relating to cloud data loss and leakage and data privacy and confidentiality. And if you think about all the stories that we're hearing in the news, right, around breaches, this makes a lot of sense as to why these are the important things, right? We need to make sure that we're protecting our data, and that is obviously the area where most people are concerned about when it comes to their organization. Data is the key to almost every organization now. And it's becoming more and more important that data is driving the way that organizations are managing their direction and their objectives moving forward. And so people with the most amount of data are the ones and that can leverage it appropriately are the businesses that are going to succeed. And that's just the reality of where we live in today. The market is saturated for many organizations across the board, and data is the thing that compels them or drives them to be more successful than the rest of the competitors out there. And so when you think about data loss and data leakage, this is one thing that we don't want in the news, right? We're hearing a lot about credit card loss, and that was kind of almost a thing of the past now, because the threat actors, they know that credit card, when you think about credit card loss, there is only a small amount of time in which that data is useful, right? If you think about your own credit cards, if you ever lost a credit card, you know that it's kind of a pain in the butt for you. But the reality there is this: number one, you as an individual consumer, uh, most of the time won't have to deal with damages associated with that, right? If somebody charged something on your credit card that you didn't authorize, most of the time the credit card company deals with that for you. Number two, uh, what happens is that cloud, that that card gets expired, and then that number is no longer useful. So that type of data, and you think about the threat actor, right? If you only have like a 24-hour window in which that card is useful or that data is useful, then the ability to sell that data, right, for use becomes less and less, right, over the course of time, right? A credit card that's been stolen, that's, a day old, is worth a lot more than a credit card that's been stolen that's worth, that's a month old, right? Because most likely that card has been deactivated at that point. So um, our threat actors know that and understand that, and so they are targeting different types of data now, right? And that's why you hear things around ransomware. And what ransomware is doing is basically encrypting the systems of your organization, whether it's in the cloud or on your on-prem infrastructure, and they're holding that data hostage, right? And that's another form of data loss when you think about it. Because as a organization, if your data is encrypted and you can't access it, the only way that you're able to restore it is hopefully from backup, or some other source, right? That you have to rebuild that data. And then data privacy and confidentiality, as we kind of continue on and with the new administration, I can continue to see that we're going to have privacy laws, especially individual privacy laws, that are going to be important. And our ability to secure that data, remove that data, is going to be more important as we think about data privacy kind of moving forward, not only from a reputation perspective, but also from a regulation perspective. And you'll see other things here around incident response and data sovereignty and control, other concerns, while important, aren't as important as obviously dealing with the data. But I'll speak to a couple of those concepts here. So when we think about the fundamentals that we have to deal with when it comes to security control, we have a couple things that we have to look at. When we think about data protection, the key thing here for project managers is to understand data flow. Where is the data coming from and where is it going to? And making sure that across that path, we are securing each and every step, right? So the acronym that we like to use is transmit, process, and store, right? Where is the data being stored? How is it being transmitted? And where is it being processed, right? In all cases, we want to make sure that that data is protected in all three of those scenarios. So just like water has multiple forms, right? The way that data moves is going to have multiple forms, right? When the data is not in motion and it's being stored, is it encrypted properly? Who has access to the keys? How can somebody gain access to that? When the data is being transmitted, being sent out, across the web, is it transmitted securely? Again, is it encrypted? And then when the data is being processed by the application, are those APIs secure? It's the application process doing that secure. Those are things as a project manager you want to make sure that you're spending a little bit of time of really understanding, and if not, making sure that we have those in our project plan to understand how these things are being done. From a vulnerability management perspective, other things that we have to kind of worry about. Are we extending our current tools into the cloud environment, or do they work, right? And that's something that we're going to really speak to in a little bit more here. But our existing security controls may not always work well in the cloud. And so with that concept, we need to bake in time to understand for the security teams to look at the cloud environment and understand, is this something that we're going to have to purchase some net new controls for or technology for? And if that's the case, that's going to add on to the time in which the project completion takes place. So something to think about from that perspective. From a firewall perspective, obviously firewalls inside of your internal organization are physical devices for the most part. In the cloud, they're virtual instances. And so do you now take that firewall and turn it into a virtual device in the cloud, or do you use cloud native tools? And those are things, again, if you're new to the cloud, you're going to want to be able to have some time for the security team to do some proof of concepts to understand what are the advantages and disadvantages associated with that. You have something called web application firewalls, and this is kind of different than your traditional firewalls, which kind of, and I know I'm talking a little bit technical here, but traditional firewalls are kind of from layer 3 and down, right? Application firewalls, when you think about the OSI layers, happen at layer 7, right? Really at the application side. And most application firewalls today have ancillary services to them, such as DDoS protection, which is a denial of service attack, right? And it protects against that. And basically what that is just a slew of information that's being jammed at your site. And the firewall is able to block the bad traffic to allow the good traffic in, right? And then API security, and I'll touch on that as well. Another piece is that logging piece, right? Not only from a operations perspective, so think debugging, up down status, but also from a security perspective. And again, are those logs are going to some place that's going to go inside of a new cloud technology, or are they going back to the inherent technology that you have on your current infrastructure? And there's nuances in terms of doing that, right? And the types of information that you need to collect. Now, the cloud providers are going to give you avenues to send your logs to different places, but there's best practices in terms of where it needs to be sent and how it needs to be sent as well. So, something to think about. And then, obviously, I talked about this encryption, and key management becomes critical here. One of the things I definitely would recommend from a key management perspective, cloud providers are very happy to provide keys for you, but then those keys are generated and stored in that cloud environment. So, as an organization, you need to understand and make decisions and determine, well, should that be stored there? Is that all okay? Or do I need to store them elsewhere, maybe on inside of my on-prem environment? And what does that look like? So, again, something to kind of think about from those control fundamentals. So, asking ourselves, does the traditional security work in the cloud? And the answer is sometimes, right? It depends on the provider, it depends on the vendor, it depends on a lot of different things. But it is something that you're gonna ask yourselves and bake into your project plans. Is this something that we can currently use our current solutions for, or are they going to be able to are we going to have to pivot to a different solution? And what does that ultimately mean? Well, if we have to pivot, it means that there is time of ramp up of training and understanding that the engineers know how to use the new products that we're going to need and operate moving forward. And a lot of our traditional tooling, if again, think about the traditional firewall, it's a physical device. Well, you can't just take that physical device and put it into a cloud environment. You're not going to have access to an AWS or Azure data center, right? So again, there's going to be some movement of those technologies when it exists in the cloud. Or the way that we protect it may look a little bit different. And so there's new concepts here that your teams are going to need to know. And as a project manager, you're going to need to make sure that we're baking in time to learn those processes and projects, our products very effectively. Because at the end of the day, these are the tools that are protecting that data that we're most concerned about, right? And we want to make sure that we're baking in time to make sure we understand that properly and what are the tooling and how do we need to take advantage of those, whether it's cloud native tools or bringing in some new technology to help us protect inside of the cloud. So the biggest threats in terms of cloud security, I know that we talked about what is our biggest concern, but the biggest threats are really around misconfiguration, unauthorized access, and interface APIs, right? And APIs are application programming interfaces, right? And so I'll spend the rest of my time really kind of focusing on these three key areas because, again, this is the biggest bang for the buck, right, when it comes to protecting our cloud environment. I'll speak to other resources to look at some of the other threats that you see down on the bottom, but I'm going to focus on these kind of three key areas. So the first one is misconfiguration. And, the problem with misconfiguration, and this is not a cloud specific issue, right? We have misconfiguration that can occur inside of our traditional environments as well. But misconfiguration is the thing that leads to most outages and most data breaches. Now, if you think about if you have kids, and if you have, and if you have younger kids like I do, you will probably have heard of Roblox. And Roblox had a huge outage that lasted, right around 48 hours. And for my kids, it was like almost like a death sentence. Like, oh my gosh, I can't get to this. I can't play my games with my friends. And I've never heard more pain from them than outside of the internet being down at my house. I guess that's the reality of kids and technology today. But what that ended up being is there were some misconfiguration issues that caused that outage eventually happen, along with some bugs and human error, right? So that's why it took them so long to kind of address that issue. And this human error can happen at any given time, right? We know that human error is one of the most painful issues when it comes to, because it's hard to diagnose, right, and hard to address and fix. Um, while training helps and automation helps, there's a lot of different ways that we can address this. It's something that all of us have to kind of deal with. And as project managers, when we're talking about a new complex area such as cloud, human error is prone to increase, especially from a learning curve perspective. On the security side, this is where it becomes very important that our security team really gets a understanding of what's really happening inside of the cloud. Oftentimes, cloud happens when a development team and architecture team go off and start throwing things into the cloud and doing development, and security is kind of brought in at the last minute. Well, when you think about that, um, we try to avoid that inside of our internal organizations as it is, but when you're bringing in a net new area that our security teams may not be even familiar with, that prone to error can increase multifold, right, associated with that. So things that are common is debugging stays enabled, incorrect permissions when you think about who has access and how that access is doled out. A lot of data leaks usually happen with misconfigured permissions around who has access to see what, leaving default credentials on. Cloud misconfiguration, again, when you think about what the customer is protecting and what they need to protect, a lot of cloud misconfiguration happens on that side. And then network and security device misconfiguration. So all these things, as a project manager, you just want to make sure that, do we have some sort of checklist when it comes to moving things from staging into production, that we're taking care of these common misconfiguration concepts that can occur, and how we need to deal with those. So some thoughts in my head in terms of how we can deal with this misconfiguration. Number one is the training of the IT staff. This, I can't stress this enough, in making sure that we not only have time to do that, but have funding to do that. Remember, if you're embarking on a new cloud journey and you're talking about new technology and new tooling, are we making sure as part of our project plan that we're A, accounting for that from a time perspective, and B, accounting for that from a funding perspective to make sure that our team is properly trained? And if that's not the case, let's make sure that we bring in a third party that can actually build it for us, and make sure that it's secure, and then potentially transfer that knowledge off, right? Again, kind of depending on your use case for the project. Things like code repositories help a lot as well. Being able to check in and check out code, making sure that we have code revisions, and that's again managed properly, so that if there are any changes to the code, that we understand what's happening there, and it actually flags us to help us understand, oh, there's a change in code, do we need to re-review some of the security posture of that code when that code change occurs, right? Having that code repository almost helps the security team flag when there needs to be checks and balances done. Web app scanning, especially on the dynamic and code perspective, kind of goes with the second bullet point. Really, again, validating that the code doesn't have any additional flaws or bugs associated with it. There's something that is put out by the Center of Internet Security. They provide hardening guidelines in terms of how to harden systems to make sure that they are secure and locked down. And the concept here is, we don't want to turn on services or have services that are turned on that we're not using. Now, a lot of your cloud providers will have this natively built in that you have to pay an additional fee for, but if you ask me, it's well worth it. So making sure that we're validating against some sort of framework that the systems are secure will save us on the long run. You have your traditional penetration testing or assessments, and this doesn't necessarily go away in the cloud environment. Now, I know with cloud, a lot of us are moving also to a DevSecOps cycle, but that traditional penetration assessment, you're still going to want to do that. You want to get your folks, professionals in to validate that they can't break into the system, right? Whether that happens through a bug bounty program or a traditional means of penetration testing, that's going to be kind of up to your organization to decide, but you want to make sure that you're again lotting time for those things to happen before things go into production. A cloud configuration assessment, having this done by a third party, especially if you're first deep diving into the cloud, really important. That cloud governance model, making sure that that's working properly. A third party can come in and really help you make determinations in terms of best practices when building a cloud environment. And I think there's a lot of good resources out there to do that. And anyone embarking on it shouldn't do it on their own, shouldn't do it in a vacuum. And I would encourage you as a project manager to empower your organization to make sure that you're doing something like that. Um, Baking security into the DevOps cycle. This is something that as we move more into cloud and trying to take advantages of the cloud, you're going to see more of this shift, right? And really, at the end of the day, it's a shift left, right, when it comes to security that we've always been talking about, making sure security is at the forefront of the operations um, and the projects, and making sure that security is built into that testing cycle and methodology. And the way that you do that is to make sure your developers are trained in secure practices as well. So not just relying on your security team, but then secure practices are being done throughout. So it becomes more of a checks and balances at that point. And giving your development teams the tools to be secure, but to do it in a way that doesn't affect their ability to code, right? In fact, there's a lot of new great technology out there that will validate code while they're coding to make sure that there aren't any misconfigurations or code issues or bugs, right, from a security perspective. You're going to want to establish a cloud change control process, right? This is going to look a little bit different than your traditional change control process. And again, when you're in that DevSecOps model or doing more agile focused delivery, that change control process is going to look a little bit different than how you would do in the traditional, weekly change meeting type of scenario, right? Because you're iterating so quickly inside an agile process, making sure that you have a good change control process, especially when things are going into production, right, is important. And the last piece I'll mention is this automation piece and automating whenever possible. And today, there's a lot of technologies such as Terraform that allow you to code everything in terms of the security mechanisms that you have to have inside of that cloud environment. So anything that you can help automate will lead to less, again, misconfiguration, misprone to errors. And so, as a project manager, again, things that are larger strategic initiatives, I would again ask that we try to spend some time in terms of learning ways to automate our technology and do that as part of the project, because that's not only going to save your organization in the long run, but then you can apply those same uh, automated scripts to the next project and the next project, making those become easier. Um, a little bit on the unauthorized access side. So we have things like a cloud governance model around access control. We want to make sure all the right logging and monitoring is available. And again, these are things that you're going to have to think about. Does these goes back to the traditional on-prem technologies, or are you using new cloud-based technology in terms of that logging, monitoring, and alerting? And if that's the case, then you're going to have to build in again some cycle time for people to learn that technology and know that there's going to be more operational overhead in terms of looking at multiple places where these logs are going to be. Things like privileged account vaulting, making sure that not just everybody has access from an admin perspective. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about the identity lifecycle in the next slide. Um, a tried and true concept of ensuring principle of least privilege, and the concept here again is making sure that people only have access to the things that they need. And when I say this, not this means not only from a user perspective, but also all the infrastructure components, and then also from a development perspective, making sure that there's separation of duties when it comes to development and production, if possible. Um, the last piece is securely storing documentation for the projects, right? A lot of the documentation that we're going to have is going to have things like a understanding of the infrastructure, the architecture, the workflows, the data flows, and with that, that's key resources for not only your organization, but if a threat actor was to get access to that, they could potentially look at and spot the security vulnerabilities inside of that application or project, right? So making sure that we're securely storing those. If you think about things like, as we move more to things like Google Cloud and O365, a lot of our documents are stored, outside in the cloud realm. Let's make sure that we're securing those and making sure that the security is in place before we embark on that sensitive data being stored in those areas. Identity lifecycle, I won't spend a lot of time here, but there's a concept here that when you bring your customers online, they have to have a digital identity. And as part of the project, you want to make sure that you're accounting for every area when it comes to the life cycle of that identity. And this becomes more and more important when we think about identity governance and some of the privacy issues, right? So authentication, are we storing fingerprints? Are we storing more than passwords? Authorization, are we including things like multi-factor authentication? What do they have access to and can't? What happens when they deregister or want that relationship to end? Can we easily delete out their identity inside of our organization? And what does that look like, not only including things like the database, but those backups, right? And what does that look like? How do we get rid of that identity when we're being asked for? So those of you that have to deal with CCPA or GDPR, right? These are important questions to ask when it comes to managing the project and managing the identity lifecycle. And then obviously registration and onboarding, right? And then how do we make sure that we're capturing the right data that we want to have that's going to be important to our business, but then also how are we securing that through that process? APIs, application programming interface, these are our interfaces into a lot of our cloud applications these days. And so with that, there's very specific cases in which we have to understand how we need to secure those APIs. And that's, again, something that's fairly new to the cloud-based world. That's not to say that you can't have APIs inside of your own internal organization, but if it's internal, there's some baked-in security by default because it's not open to the rest of the internet, right? Versus in a cloud application, these APIs, they can be external facing, and we need to make sure that they're secure. I won't tap into like how an API works too much, but for the most part, it's a interface between the data and the user interface, right? That's the crux of it, and it allows you to kind of communicate between those areas. And those streams of APIs are the things that we need to protect, right? That connective tissue there. So when we think about that, we know to make sure that we're inventorying and managing those appropriately. We want to make sure that we're using the right amount of authentication associated with those APIs. Again, that encryption. A lot of these practices and concepts are not new in the sense of things that were tried and true from security, but now we just have to apply it to the APIs. And again, making sure that from a PM perspective, we're making sure that these checks and balances are happening, right? Baking this in from a security perspective. The last piece I'll kind of touch on, and then we'll wrap up here, is how do we mitigate some of these cloud-based security issues, right? I talked about training. I talked about budget to some extent, and then the data privacy pieces. But these are again the key barriers that we have. And so when we're starting up a project, making sure that we're allotting time and budget for security, especially for new cloud projects, I would allot a little bit more here because it's going to make a difference between whether we're going to have dealing with a breach later on in the future, or we're protecting our data properly. So kind of some, the key takeaways, I've kind of mentioned this. One thing that you can do is MVP cloud security solutions as part of your project and bake that in so that you can quickly kind of move through and understand if that's something that's going to work or not. And I can't stress this enough in terms of that legal and privacy regulation review with the your legal team and your security teams. That's going to be a longer straw in the tent, and you want to make sure that you're taking care of that as quickly as possible on the front end so that it doesn't become a burden for when you're trying to launch the applications or go into production. Just a quick couple of links for you guys in terms of additional training. I know I covered quite a bit here pretty quickly from a security perspective. Um, a good thing if you're new into cloud, and I don't care if it's AWS or GCP or Azure, the AWS Fundamentals is free, and it will walk you through a lot of different concepts. Now, it does focus a little bit more obviously on AWS, but those concepts can be applied to the other cloud vendors, so don't worry about it. There's Google Project Manager, that's through Coursera. And the reason why that one's specifically I call that out is because at Google they're 100% cloud, right? And so understanding concepts there I think are important. The Cloud Security Alliance has been around for almost the birth of the cloud, and it really provides a lot of good data points associated with what you need to know from a cloud perspective. They also have something that they publish called the OWASP Top 10. And so again, that's something to kind of look at, and that's the top 10 security issues that you have in the cloud. ISACA has a cloud auditing knowledge, and again, you're not necessarily an auditor as a PM, but understanding what auditors are going to look for and things that you can then think about inside of your own programs to then apply to your project, I think isn't a bad thing. And of course, there's a lot of acronyms when it comes to cloud, a lot of new things, the glossary of terms. I put in a couple of these, online training organizations like Pluralsight, Cloud Guru, Udemy. I don't necessarily think anyone is better than the other, but they all have very good cloud training, and they're all pretty cheap at the end of the day, right? A subscription to any of these is around like $500 a year, and $500 is like, when you think about your own professional career path, is not a lot of money to spend, right? When it comes to gaining more knowledge at the end of the day. So with that, I know I have a little bit of time left, and we'll take some questions. And let me look really quickly through the chat if I can look through some questions. How change management is different from cloud and ITSM? Oh, absolutely. This is one of the fundamental challenges that we have right now. If you think about agile practices, right? And so I want to talk about a little bit about agile and traditional change management. So through agile processes, you don't have as the concepts of stage gates anymore, right? You have 2-week sprints where things happen and iterate, and then they get pushed, and then you move on to the next sprint, right? And so during that time, it's very hard because you could be going through up to 50 changes into your environment in any given sprint. The concept of having a weekly change meeting kind of goes away, right, where changes get approved. So as a PM, you have to kind of figure out, and really as an organization, you need to understand how are we going to manage change moving forward, and what is the acceptable level of risk that we're taking on associated with those changes. Now you still have to worry about backup plans and those types of pieces, But in the cloud environment, you want to make sure that you're using technology to automate some of those pieces, doing peer reviews, um, and you're putting on a certain amount of risk in terms of allotting for how we effectively manage that change. And it's going to look a little bit different for every organization. Just something to kind of keep in mind. Are there security concerns different in a hybrid environment versus fully cloud based? I would say yes and no. And again, I hate to give the depends answer here. I would say that there are issues or cloud components that need to be secured differently than on-prem environment, and so that adds complexity, right? And then you have the concept of connecting your cloud environment to your on-prem environment, and that adds additional complexity. So the concerns are going to be different just because of the additional complexity that's added and the different technologies that you're going to have. Again, I mentioned like a lot of the traditional security technology and controls may not work in your cloud environment. And so when you're dealing with hybrid, now you have a team that has to deal with both of those different technology components, and that leads to complexity, and then complexity leads to misconfiguration, problems, etc. Right? Okay, Joe, available tools for cloud, improving, changing, more and more organizations accepting moving to these external tools or resources. There are a lot of tools available for cloud security, and and here's the rub. There's a lot of tools that are for cloud security that are only for cloud security as well. So if you're a 100% based cloud environment, that's fantastic for you. Those are going to work really well. But when you move into areas of hybrid where you're still on prem and not, some of those cloud tools aren't going to work well or don't work at all for an on prem environment. And so that causes, again, issues where you're having to do a little bit of swivel chair from an operations perspective. And again, causing complexity. I don't have a good answer. There are organizations and vendors out there that are kind of tackling both. So you kind of have to make your own decisions as to is that good enough for you, or do you keep it separate? And and this is going to vary based off of your environment, the amount of people that you can throw at these things. If you're moving to a product based organization, maybe the product teams, you have a cloud based product and non cloud based product, so maybe that's okay. So there's a lot of depends associated with that, but yes, there are tools available. Glenn, help me out if I've missed some of these questions. How may we access them?
There's one other. What does a security team need from a project manager to be successful when it comes to running a project?
I would say making sure that you have the business requirements associated with what the security team needs to understand, right? So, what are the data requirements? What are the access requirements? Who needs access to what and when? What type of data is going to be inside? Is cloud the only answer, right? Have these things actually been flushed out already? Is it going to access backend infrastructure that's back on prem? That's another consideration that the security team is going to definitely need to know. Are there APIs tied to the application? Is there going to be a mobile app tied to the application? Because if it's web-based versus mobile-based versus both, there's considerations there when it comes to a security team. So all those are things that would be good to know. And again, the time frames of the project as much as possible, right? And milestones associated with it so that they can plan on when to do the penetration testing, when's the access going to need to be implemented, etc., etc. Okay. Let's see what else we got here. Great questions so far, guys. Thanks.
And we have two last questions, and then we will have to wrap up this session.
Okay. How does the
So one from Daniel. How does the project and PM account for security tools such as IAM, logging, intrusion detection, design and architecture, and integration challenges when dealing with products as a service or container-based apps? These integration challenges can kill cloud native app development and or any kind of migrations from on-prem facilities.
Yeah, this is a great question. And so when you're dealing with things like containerization, Docker, or using Kubernetes, right? Again, this is a new world for probably a lot of security team members. And so when you think about these integration challenges and you think about your, traditional security team, they might not necessarily have the skill sets to deal with this because this is net new for them as well. So as your development team grows, we need to have make sure that the security team is growing. And if you don't have that skill set on site, you need to have frank conversations with that security team. Hey, these are net new technologies that we're dealing with. Do we need to bring in a third party that has expertise in terms of helping us determine how to secure these and then how to monitor those appropriately? And security teams, I like to think, aren't necessarily that egotistical, but they can be, right? I mean, we're all human. And so how do you make sure that we're making sure that, like, hey, you're probably going to need some help in this area, right? And let me help you, you know, uh, help the organization at the end of the day. Because remember, our goals are aligned in terms of what do we want to do? We want to make sure that our company is secure. We're not headline news for breaches or ransomware. And the way that we can do this is partner together. Is there a certification process for verifying the application has passed cloud security checks? Apple Store review process. Yes, there is things like that. Is there a certification process for cloud review? I don't think there's a certification per se, but there are best practices associated with that. And so with that concept, you want to test for OWASP top 10. You want to make sure that that passes muster. Again, look at Cloud Security Alliance for best practices. And then again, I would say, some of the external third-party vendors, work with one that's done a lot more on the cloud side from a validation perspective, and that's going to help you out a lot. I would say the hardening guidelines, that is something that you can definitely do from a validation perspective, and a lot of the cloud tooling will check against that OWASP top 10 to validate that at least you're hitting the big pieces and not missing the mark there.
Okay, thank you so very much, Dr. Kwong. This brings us to the conclusion of our session. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our talented and insightful presenter, Dr. Fred Kwong. As a token of appreciation, the chapter would like to present to you with a certificate, which we will be sending out to you shortly.
Yep.
Thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.